You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Without further ado, we have our guest today, Dan Kish, who's with the Institute for Energy Research. Hey, Dan, it's great to have you back on the Final Say Radio Show. Welcome. This is Brett and John today.
Hi, Brett. Hi, John.
Well, Dan, we've been discussing this great story, and I call it a great story because I think it followed through, and if we really pursue it, and if we really discuss it and make it the leading story, that the American people will really benefit from it, our economy will benefit from it, and quite frankly, I think the world, because of America's prosperity, will benefit from it. And we're talking about fracking right now. We're talking about horizontal fracking. We're talking about energy exploration and taking advantage of the resources that we have.
Yeah, I mean, it is an amazing story. I think people are just starting to get some idea about it. There's a lot of discussion about it, but in honesty, you ain't seen nothing yet. This actually is going to take the rewiring of people's brains and government policies. It's that profound in its potential, and the reason I say that is because, for at least two generations in this country, and actually it started much before that, but for certainly the last two generations, we've all been taught that all of our policies should reflect the fact that we are running out of energy resources. And as we've discussed in the past, and as we at the Institute for Energy Research have been trying to point out by simply using the government's own reports, nothing could be further from the truth. We're not running out of oil. We're running into it. Wherever we drill for it. It's largely a technological advance, and let me tell you, the technology that's being used is incredible, but it's changing the world. It has the opportunity to change geopolitically, and the consequences for economic growth in the United States as a result of it. There's nothing that's happening in the U.S. economy today that is more profound than the impact both of the increased production of energy and the reduction in cost and its benefits to consumers and productivity and all the rest.
Well, that's right. Dan, when we spoke earlier in the week, I had mentioned to you that I watched a hearing last week on C-SPAN, and a lot of the people at this hearing in Washington, D.C., were from California, the Dakotas. I think one was from Wisconsin, I believe, or somewhere in those areas. So mainly up north, out west. And what struck me was all of the experts from California were discussing how much they thought that they had just in California. I mean, an incredible amount of natural gas, an incredible amount of oil that could be tapped into. But the same story flowed from all of them, and it was, but we probably won't ever touch it. And I'm thinking to myself, California is such a big state. They have such dire economic and financial problems right now. All we ever hear about is, well, they have this is a good year. It's only an $8 billion deficit in California. I mean, and you think about all the projects that they want to do, such as high-speed rail, and they want to rebuild their school system and all these things. And I'm thinking to myself, Dan, if California just took advantage of their energy resources, and I suppose just their agricultural resources as well, they would create so much wealth, so many jobs, and create the revenue just naturally through the economic cycle that they'd be able to do and accomplish the things they want to do without going through the economic barbarity, if you will.
Yeah, they're sitting on what looks to be the largest shale oil deposit in the country, one of them, just one of their deposits, and to put it in perspective, it's the largest, but it's important people understand this. The government makes estimates about how much oil we have or gas, and in the case of North Dakota, in 2007, we asked the Department of Interior, who looks at such things, the United States Geological Survey, how much oil there was in North Dakota, and that number came back at 151 million barrels of oil. Since then, they have increased that 50 times. The amount is now 50 times as much. Many people believe it's going to be 4, 5, 6 times larger than that if they recover 4% of the oil in place, meaning that 96% of it is still left in the ground. If you take a look at places like California that have much larger deposits and apply the same sort of logical conclusion that if you look for things, you find it, and that if you're allowed to look, you find it, and then you figure out better ways to get it out, those numbers become astronomical very, very quickly. And what's happening is there are really smart people involved in both the technological as well as the applied mechanics of getting after this, and they are working 24/7 to figure out new and better ways to do this and do it more cheaply and do it more efficiently. And so the future is very bright, but California continues to do what California is doing to itself. It's sad to watch the Golden State turn to lead.
That's a great point. Dan, I was looking at a report that I found on the Institute for Energy Research's website, and I believe, is this based on the Mason report? If I think I have that correct. And I was looking at, there's a chart that talks about if we were to actually use and open up the restricted drilling areas, what benefit it would have. And I'm just looking at GDP growth, and I'll throw out some of these numbers, and I'd like you to expand upon this. And is this based, also the question is, are these numbers based on just what we know now or what we potentially can have, and does it include all the private and public lands as well? So just looking at this, says GDP could increase $127 billion annually for the next 7 years, and then after that, for almost another 30 years, $450 billion. And you're looking at a cumulative over $14 trillion of economic activity. And I'm sorry, over the next 30 years, which is just that's like the China story, isn't it?
Yes, and yet your questions were good ones. That is the most conservative assessment of what this Mason study, who's head of the economics department at Louisiana State University and also teaches at Wharton, shows us is that these are the government's own estimates. Remember, I just mentioned the 151 million barrels before they started looking and found what they're finding. That's what that number represents. The potential is that it will climb along those same lines if allowed to do it. And what those numbers represent is the resource that belongs to the taxpayer, federal lands and waters that, if opened, could provide both instant and long-term economic benefit, as well as energy, which in large volumes would drop the price of energy, which would mean people have money to spend on other things instead of putting into their gas tanks. So we're talking about enormous estimates. Earlier this week, Barclays produced a report looking at the impact of shale oil and shale gas development in the United States, and at the end of it, they pointed out that the job growth between 2005 and now, and of course it's experienced a downturn, but the actual increase in jobs between 2005 and now, 43% of those jobs were directly and indirectly, without the extended indirect benefits of lower energy prices and the like, attributable to energy production increases in the United States, all of which, by the way, is happening on state and private lands, on the government's lands, on the ones owned by you and me and every taxpayer listening, that production has gone down. We have a 40% increase on the private lands and a reduction on the government lands. Kind of shows you who manages their lands better, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, I always thought the free market is the only way that really works. Dan, just looking at, again, some of these numbers, and you don't even have to look at the specific numbers, but you're talking billions and trillions. But essentially what happens as you create the new market and a long-term plan that's certainly viable, you're also increasing revenues to government. So all this talk in Washington on one side of the aisle that we have to raise taxes, the other side that we have to reduce spending, I mean, to me, if we just say, hey, guys, let's go all in. Let's take advantage of what our land has to offer us, and then naturally, over the next few years, you'll see so many million more jobs created, revenues to all levels of government, and like you said, with cheaper energy, people have more money to spend in other sectors, which will help grow them. I think you'll see all the growth that we all had hoped would have happened after our near depression that we experienced over the last few years. This is just a great story, and I think, it's a shame that this story will be portrayed in the media, most places, as, well, what's the environmental impact, or, those evil oil corporations, or, whatever angle they're going to take it at, but they're never going to actually say, hey, this is good for American people, it's good for American companies, it's good for our governments as well, and we could pass this along to the rest of the world, like I said.
Well, exactly. If we had a 40% increase in the production of computers in the United States, people would be saying, that's a wonderful thing, aren't we great? Look at us, we're the best in the world. We've got a 40% increase in our production from private lands, and it's not a story, despite the fact that in terms of the overall impacts on our economy, the consequences of that energy are significantly more than the consequences of that computer production. Because it makes everything else go. It is, after all, it's the largest, energy is the largest business in the world by far, and it makes agriculture, for example, the ability to get fresh fruits and vegetables and meats and all the rest of the things that we all consume affordably delivered to our tables. It keeps the lights on so people can study at night instead of having to go to bed. All of these things. That's what the increase in energy does. And right now, as a matter of fact, while it may not be a story here in the United States as significant as it deserves, it is a huge story in Europe. Europe is shaking in its boots right now because of the fact that the ongoing private sector development in the United States and what it means for energy production. They are talking about literally whether they ought to even try to compete with the United States or whether they ought to drop industrialization from their economic model. The International Energy Agency, which is headquartered there, began a discussion about that recently because they basically have indicated that there's no way that Europe can compete with the United States if we have low-cost energy. Why that isn't a story in the United States and why it doesn't seem to affect the actions of the White House and members of Congress is beyond me, but other people see it. They just don't seem to see it here.
Well, Dan, let's be honest. We are rich in mineral and energy resources. We are shallow in governance and thinking. So speaking of which, I want to change the subject around a little bit. And one of the big issues here, we have all this enormous potential, and the irony is this country's growth was really derived from energy wealth, starting with all the folks in Texas, right, who started setting up and drilling everywhere, and of course, before you knew it, we were a boom nation, and we can be that boom nation again, as you pointed out. The question I have for you, and I want to ask, by the way, can you hold, after I ask the question, can you hold momentarily when we
Sure,
take a brief break? Okay. So the question I have for you is this concerns, I want to go geopolitical, but I want to start here at home. You obviously have the biggest risk to the success here, in my opinion. It's not technological, it's regulatory and governance and so forth. You already have states like Illinois, the great state of Chicago. You already have states like Illinois and so forth who are passing and trying to fight fracking, and you have other states who welcome the jobs and welcome the economic boom. So the question here is, how much do you believe the risk of regulation is to stifle this growth? And I'd like you to answer that both in a public versus private land, but also from the difference between government regulation versus state regulations, because my supposition here is this could be the true trial balloon that shows how one state can prosper enormously based on its policy, while another one, Illinois, might actually suffer greatly. So with that question, I'm going to ask Beatrice to take us to break, and I'll let you noodle on that for a second, and then we'll come right back momentarily.
You bet.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Final Say radio program with your hosts, John and Brett. And, of course, we have Dan on the line. Dan Kish is with the Institute for Energy Research. So, Dan, I'll let you jump right back in and answer the question I had just asked. Yeah,
John. The risk here is political. It's not geological. It's not technical. It's the technical risk is on the upside. As I indicated, we're talking about huge numbers with 3 or 4% recovery. What happens is that extends to 10% or 15%. Will be written in the history books. Luckily, we have something in the United States which actually has helped us more than anything, and as folks interested in liberty, you understand this. It's called private property. That's why this is happening on the private lands, whereas the sort of communally owned lands where decisions are made in Washington, it's not happening. Hydraulic fracturing. The real story is, despite all the antics of the folks who are opposed to carbon-based energy production in the United States, which is what the anti-hydraulic fracturing, anti-Keystone, anti-ANWR, anti-OCS, anti movement's all about, is that we've done it over 1 million times in the United States with much less stringent environmental regulation for the past 60 years, with no verified impact on any kind of groundwater thing. And yet the government continues to push forward. The states have been regulating this. States all do it differently, but none of them want the federal government involved in this. They don't want the government sticking their nose in what happens with the water that runs underneath that state, which has been traditionally a property right of the state or private owner, depending on which state it's in. But having said that, the real risk here is political, and let me just give you an example. Permitting in 2012 on federal lands, in order to get a permit to drill, took an average of 228 days. In Ohio, it takes 14 days. In North Dakota, it takes 10 days. North Dakota has a small amount of federal land. On those lands, it takes an average of 228 days. It takes them 23 times as long to get someone who's willing to put up millions of dollars to drill a well and hire people and put them to work, and who may be borrowing the money to do it in the first place, certainly is from shareholders or investors. And so the landowner or the landowner who owns private land is able to work a deal and go through all the regulatory requirements of the states and come up with the same sort of permit. And if the federal government attempts to extend itself into these private lands, by coming up with some. And right now they're searching. They're trying every door lock. They're out on basically a witch hunt, trying to figure out how can they justify getting their foot in the door. Then we risk the same kinds of delays, and obviously those delays would compound the difficulties that people have in producing that energy. So yeah, this is a political issue. It's not we don't have a geological or technical issue. It doesn't exist. So what we've got is a government that says that it wants to reduce dependency on foreign sources, produce more energy at home, taking 23 times as long to okay someone who wants to help contribute to that effort as it takes the government of North Dakota to make the same decision.
Well, I think it's extremely important. By the way, it struck me when you mentioned the 220 some odd days it takes to get that approval on federal lands. On the bright side, that's a lot shorter than it takes for a conservative nonprofit organization to get approved by the IRS. So the government could be a lot worse.
Good point.
So, when I look at this game, you just brought up energy security, and to me, energy security and economic security are something we can't ignore. And there's a handful of reasons why, and we've discussed this before on this show, why it's so important. Partly because we are not just outsourcing jobs, but the amount of money. Every $1 billion economically equates to about $5,000, $200,000 a year cost jobs. That's an awful lot, and we have hundreds of billions of revenues that leave our shore, and so much of that is actually going to states who, well, let's just suffice it to say, they're not big fans of liberty and of America and our way of life. And I thought this was interesting. We're discussing political, but there's a social issue here that I want to tie in, which is like all these fracking and anti-fracking films. And I'm sure you're probably aware, Matt Damon, who is in this film Promised Land, which I haven't seen because if I want to see it, I'll see it when it doesn't cost me a penny and I'm not supporting them. But I found out that one of the big backers of that film, surprise, surprise, is a film company that's owned by the United Arab Emirates. It's a government-owned film, and of course, the UAE has an awful lot to lose by our successful extraction of mineral resources here in the U.S. So I wanted to get your opinions on not just the anti-fracking movement, because that's equal, in my opinion, to government, but also on who are the people behind these movements who are fighting this and why.
Yep. Great question, John. Well, a lot of it is just self-interest. I mean, if I'm Yoko Ono and I've got a weekend place up in upstate New York, and I like the current price that I pay the local laborers because there's high unemployment up there, I can caterwaul about how this is going to destroy my weekends or something, and a lot of that comes from that sort of celebrity money to throw around. But let me tell you something. I mean, anybody who doesn't believe that governments act in their own interest when it comes to energy security around the world is living on another planet. The Saudis had been sort of non-disturbed by the production response in the United States, but last month they began to take notice in a big way, and they're trying to now, along with the rest of OPEC, figure out what to do as some significant changes are on their way. But this week's Weekly Standard actually has a wonderful, lengthy article about Vladimir Putin and the Russians and Gazprom, which supplies most of Europe's gas, and what the consequences of shale gas have meant for him, and what it's meant for the value of Gazprom, which is the state-owned, and all of his cronies that he's appointed to that, and how they've been working in Europe to look for bans on hydraulic fracturing in the various countries throughout Europe try to affect that because they recognize that this could just undermine their entire ability to do what they did several years ago. And if they've got a political problem with the Ukraine, they just shut off the gas. Ronald Reagan warned about this in the 1980s when the first gas pipelines were moving into Europe from the Soviet Union at the time. And there's some allegation that that our intelligence services had something to do with a enormous explosion of a pipeline at the time. I mean, this is real politics. This is what happens. Energy runs the world. If you have the energy necessary and can sell it to someone else, you don't want them lessening their demand for this and going somewhere else, especially if it happens to be in their own backyard. So is it happening here in the United States? I mean, clearly the UAE, maybe they just thought the Matt Damon movie was a good investment. Maybe there was something else afoot. As it turns out, I don't think that movie was a great investment. But there's a lot of times governments will say things and do something different, or sponsor, as they did in the Cold War, opposition movements in other countries to things that actually seek to benefit the country for either military or energy or national security interest. This is all tied up. I mean, this is the stuff of spy novels, but it certainly enters the discussion. Meanwhile, we've got politicians running around in Washington talking about absurd arguments based on mockumentaries that aren't based in fact, that are trumped up, and this is the sort of dialogue that our leaders, frankly, threaten our liberties by pursuing.
Well, that's true, and sadly, though, I think there's a few issues that come together here. One is the EPA has proven that it could be used as literally a shutdown weapon, right? I mean, you could stop things cold in their tracks with a single regulatory blow. The second is that winning the hearts and minds is not a game of intellectual honesty very often, right? It's just a game of brinksmanship, and one side is typically going to win. And just think about the ramifications of somebody like I think it was Barbara Boxer, who was coming out yesterday about how global warming caused that tornado, right? Like anybody really knows what caused that particular tornado that day, right? It has to do with cold and hot and cold air mass and moisture and directions, right? But now when people hear that, then you have a bunch of young people who think, oh my God, we're going to have all these additional tornadoes, and you have this problem with how you win it. But I want to point one thing out in particular, which if you're not tracking is probably an interesting one to do in these lines, is there's a significant amount of money that's being spent by these oil nations in Middle Eastern studies departments all over our universities. So we actually have the next generation of minds are already being influenced by oil wealth money that we shipped out to unfriendly countries. And I want to point that out not just in the context of its immediate effect, but the counter effect of having our own energy independence and being able to fund and support the things that help make this country great are profoundly important, not just in creating jobs now, but in making sure that we're actually in control of our own destiny and future.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Again, this is something that is not discussed in polite company here in Washington because people think this, that's absurd. That doesn't happen. These are just commercial decisions. Believe me, they're not just commercial decisions. They're decisions about national security. They're decisions about economic growth and what that means in terms of the battle for who is number one in the world. It's about whether people will literally live or die around the world, because energy is central to that whole discussion. And energy is a great enabling force to lift people out of poverty, change the way the world operates in a lot of ways, perhaps empower people around the world. And there are plenty of people who don't, frankly, like that. just as soon have faithful and ignorant subjects. And you're absolutely right that this battle is conducted in the cultural war that surrounds it is conducted in a situation where we've got absolutely absurd claims by people like Sheldon Whitehouse and Barbara Boxer and others regarding the genesis of a tornado. It just so happens that Oklahoma just experienced the coldest spring on record, and meteorologists will tell you that the history of tornadic activity is directly related to how cold it is. And the colder it is, the more tornadoes you get, because once it starts warming up, sucking up that hot air from the Gulf, you get this sort of activity. And the 1950s was a tremendous tornadic decade, and it's expected that will because of some changes in the ocean that are cyclical is probably going to place us in that same sort of a repeat performance here in the United States. So, we're talking about real things, and then we've got people running these side agendas, trying to convince us to switch our entire economy over to green energy or whatever it may be, based upon the weather. It's almost like Aztec or Mayan kings who used eclipses that they knew were coming because they had astronomers who could predict such things, to scare people into giving more of their grain and money to the king. I mean, this is a sort of nonsense that, frankly, ought to be rejected in a society that prides itself on its educational prowess. But unfortunately, some of those, some of the altars from which this is being preached happen to be in the in schools of higher learning, some of which are funded by the very sources you point to.
Yeah. Dan, before I ask this, I want to ask you something about carbon tax. But before I do that, I just want to mention, I'm sure you'll have a comment as well, that it takes energy to create green energy. In other words, if we want to make solar panels, if we want to make windmills, or if we want to create turbines for water, or whatever you were talking about, we have to spend energy to make that stuff. So this isn't like, oh, it's all that we're ever going to be able to just go green. And then the other issue is, well, two other issues. One, we know about the subsidies and a lot of failed companies in the green energy industry, but also we haven't been all that competitive with countries such as China in making solar panels or some other components. But without getting into that too majorly, I'll let you comment on that. But my real question, and something else that we really need to discuss, is the carbon tax. And, we see all these IRS scandals, and I think most of us would agree, at least in the conservative aisles, that maybe we should just repeal the 16th and put in a fair tax and be done with all this business. But a carbon tax, to me, and it's surprising that there are some conservatives or like-minded people who would say, hey, okay, yeah, it's not just a bad idea. I don't think they understand it, and I think you could explain why it's really a poor idea.
Well, it takes energy to make advanced forms of energy. One of the reasons why, despite the fact that you don't have to pay for fuel for wind and solar, they're more expensive than their counterparts that require fuel, is because it takes a lot of technology, a lot of minerals, which consume lots of energy in making and lots of energy to make them. So the boxes that you may get the free energy, but the product is more expensive than the alternative, which requires energy to burn. In terms of the carbon tax, there seems to be, and it's by the way, this is in some cases well funded by some of the normal suspects. There are large corporations who like carbon taxes. They like the idea that they can game the system and do this, and there are also people who have a history of being fairly free market economists. Art Laffer's one of them. Who has suggested that maybe a carbon tax isn't a bad way to go. just think value-added tax, and you've got yourself a carbon tax. And it's a sneaky way of doing it because it'll show up in the price of all your products instead of the government taking it out of your check at the end of the week. I mean, they already take it out of your check because they don't want you having to send it in. There's a reason why they have withholding. Because if people had to write a check to the government and saw what it was, they would be extremely upset. Most people don't have to do that.
Right.
But carbon is generated by somewhere close to about 85% of our energy. And if you put a tax on it, it's going to affect the price of everything. It's going to insinuate itself throughout the process, and also gives politicians who might argue that we should start with something small. Every time there's a tornado, there will be a move before the Finance Committee in the Senate and the Ways and Means Committee in the House by the usual suspects to increase, obviously, the tax because it's clearly not having the sort of desired effect. It's basically just another way to pick your pocket. And here's the other part. If anyone believes that we're somehow going to do away with the withholding system and the tax and replace it with a carbon tax, I'll tell you exactly what's going to happen. We're going to end up with both. Because the size of our debt is so extreme. And the one thing you don't want to do if you want growth is to impose a tax on productivity. And the thing that makes productivity advance is energy. It is the enabling force of the universe that allows machines to take over things that people used to do. By increasing the cost of that, you're in essence putting the brakes on productivity, slowing growth. And it simply makes no sense. It's just another. You might as well put a tax on water consumption. Actually, water consumption wouldn't be as significant as a tax on carbon. So, and in those places where they are doing it, dismal failure. Europe's system is falling apart. They are backing away from it very rapidly. They're also backing away from alternative forms of energy. They're now looking at, as I mentioned, they're looking at our economy and saying, we want to be more like them, which is saying something because we don't look that great.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. Well, Dan, we started off with a great idea, the continuation of natural gas and oil exploration in the country to help develop the economy and introduce new jobs to the economy and in return increase revenues to local, state, and federal governments. And now we're finishing up with our conversation with the carbon tax, which actually does the opposite. So I think we would all agree on, after this very lengthy discussion, that the way to go is prosperity, free markets, and enterprise. And that all happens with increased exploration, more permits, and more oil and gas drilling. But, Dan, I want to thank you so much for taking your time today to go over these very important issues, what I think is the biggest storyline of the coming decades for this nation and for our people. And, again, great stuff as always.
Well, thank you both.
And of course, everybody can go to the instituteforenergyresearch.org, and you can follow any of the reports or any of the things going on. And, of course, Dan, always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you both.
All right, take care.
Always a pleasure.